Hello everyone, this is Hesterry, and today I'm going to be doing something a little different. This is going to be the first in a series of videos on how to design a practical and fully functional ship in Space Engineers, from coming up with a concept to developing a layout, and finally building the ship itself. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a mod-free, large grid ship that'll be between 5 and 10,000 blocks by using a pretty simple 5-step process. I'll also be explaining why I do things the way I do, in the hopes that you can better translate these techniques into your own building process. Please keep in mind though that this series is meant for people who already know how to play Space Engineers and build ships. I may briefly explain how some things work, but I'm not going to be going into too much detail. Also, I'll be recording the building process live, meaning there'll be very little editing involved, and I encourage you to follow along and build a ship of your own design as I go. I do have a very basic idea of what I'm going to build, but for the most part, you're going to see my entire creative and building process from start to finish. Since I'm recording this way, I'll definitely be making mistakes, so please feel free to ask any questions in the comments below. If I don't answer them there, I'll try to do it in a future episode. Before we jump in though, 2 more things I'd like to mention. First, this tutorial is being made with creative mode in mind. While the same process can be used to design a ship in survival, doing so requires much more careful planning. Personally, I like to develop my more elaborate ships in creative and then take the blueprint and build them in survival. Second, keep in mind that designing good functional ships, like any skill, takes a little time to develop. If your first few ships don't turn out well, don't give up. Go back, look at what you did wrong, what you did right, and what you can improve on, and then try again. Alright, let's get started. Before actually building anything though, it's very important to do a little bit of planning, so I'm gonna hop into Photoshop. Don't worry, I'm just using it to take some notes and do a very basic sketch. A simple piece of paper and pencil will do just fine. So the first step I take when I want to build a new ship is come up with a core idea for what I want the vessel to do. So I start by asking myself, what kind of ship is it? Is it a combat ship, a logistics vessel, or is it a mining rig? Also, what scale are we looking at? Is it a tiny puddle jumper like a fighter, or is it a massive super capital ship made up of tens of thousands of blocks? Will this ship serve a special role or purpose? Is it going to have some kind of gimmick, such as a custom weapon or tool? Asking these questions will really help through the creative and building process, so it's always good to take a little extra time to plan. Also, as a side note, if you're going to be building any custom weapons or relying on anything physics-based, thoroughly test everything possible in-game before you try and build a ship that uses it. If you've been on my channel, you've probably seen my Reaper missile. It may not be obvious from how simple the weapon first appears, but while the building process itself only took about an hour, I easily spent 100 hours testing different ideas, physics mechanics, and theories in order to be absolutely sure everything worked exactly the way I thought it did. So let's go over those questions again. First of all, what type of vessel do we want to make? A combat ship? A logistics vessel? Like a repair ship or a grinder or even a refinery? Or a mining ship? Now I'm quite partial to combat ships, and they're what I have the most experience building, so that's probably what I'm going to make for this tutorial. Next, what size of a vessel are we going to make? Also, what grid size? Now, as I said earlier, I'm going to be making a large grid ship of about 5 to 10,000 blocks. So let's make a note of that. Oops. 5 to 10,000 blocks. Next, what role is this ship going to serve? Now, some time ago, I saw Wedgehog's Ship of the Line video, and I thought I wanted to create something similar to that. If you don't know what a Ship of the Line is, it's a ship that usually gets into close quarters on the front lines of battle, and it basically tries to win through superior close-range firepower, typically by using broadside weaponry. So that's probably what I'm going to do. Ship of the line. Some other examples, though, would be a ship designed for scouting, or a specialized anti-fighter ship, or an anti-station ship, things like that. The next question is the ship going to have any gimmicks, like special weapons or tools? Now, I'm quite partial to gravity drives and player-made weapons, so I'm definitely going to have some of that. Gravity drive and PMWs, aka player-made weapons. However, you could also have a custom tool or special scripting, other things that will make your ship unique. So now we have a very basic idea of what we want this ship to do. But let's flesh it out a little more. So let's start here. Ship of the line. So, there are a lot of things to consider when you're designing your ship, from its speed to the weapons it carries and its other capabilities. But first of all, let's start with the very basics. How fast does this ship need to be? Now, considering this is a ship of the line and it's meant to sit in the front lines of combat, it's probably going to need to be very heavily armored. This means that it's going to be quite slow. However, seeing as that it does need to get in the front lines, we need to find some way of making it reasonably fast. Now this leaves us with two options. We can either add a lot of thrusters, or we can give it a gravity drive. Now, as I mentioned earlier, right here, I'm quite fond of gravity drives. So we're probably going to do that instead of adding a whole lot of thrusters. And as I mentioned, seeing as this is a frontline ship, it needs to have a lot of heavy armor. Oops. Heavy armor. Now, if this were a lighter vessel, I'd make a note that it's going to be primarily light armor, but that isn't the case here. So the next question is, what kind of weapons is the ship going to have? Now, of course, it is a combat ship, so it's going to need to have quite a lot in the way of weaponry. That said, there are three basic kinds of weapons available to large grid ships. They're the rocket launchers, which can only fire in a straight line. We have turrets, which are controlled by AI or optionally by the player. And then you have PMWs, the player-made weapons. Oops. Additionally, PMWs are divided into three categories: torpedoes, or dumbfire weapons, basically these are projectiles that are unguided, and you'd use gravity or thrusters to just shoot them in the direction of your enemy. There are also missiles, which can either be remote controlled by a player or use some advanced scripting to guide them. And additionally, it's worth noting that these can either be purely kinetic or warhead based. And that applies to both torpedoes and missiles. And then there are ore bombs, much like my Reaper. And these work by ejecting cargo filled with rocks or iron ore into the enemy target. There's also the option of PMWs being reloadable. And this means that the ship has the capacity to build more in combat using welders. And it is worth considering whether you want your PMWs to be reloadable, as it will pretty dramatically affect the structure of your ship, as a reloading system usually takes up a lot of space. Now let's go over the differences between these weapons. Rocket launchers are very, very powerful. They can chew through pretty much anything in a matter of seconds. However, they do require that your vessel be aimed directly at the target, so that they can hit. And there are some ways around this using PMWs, but for the most part, they only shoot in a straight line. Turrets are entirely controlled by AI, but they're pretty weak. You're not going to be actually destroying a ship with them. It would take huge amounts of ammo. Instead, they're good for taking out enemy turrets and other exposed components. PMWs, on the other hand, are very good for destroying ships in their entirety, taking out all of their internal systems, like reactors and cargo, or even the crew, for relatively small investment. Now in this case, for this ship, I'm going to be using all 3 rocket launchers, turrets, and PMWs. And considering that this ship is meant to get in close, I think I'm going to be using basic torpedoes without warheads. I'm going to be using basic torpedoes because we're close enough that we probably won't need any kind of guidance system. Now, since I don't want this ship to be too big, I'm probably not going to have these PMWs be reloadable. They'll be single shot. The next question is, what kind of power source is the ship going to use? So there are 3 options: solar, batteries, and reactors. Now solar, while it doesn't require any fuel at all, is not all that strong, and it does always leave your power source exposed. Plus, you have to have them facing the sun at all times, so this is really not good for a combat ship. So we're going to cross that out. Batteries are pretty decent. However, you do have to rely on another ship to charge your vessel, and if you run out of power in combat, you're pretty much screwed. So we're going to cross that off as well. We will stick to reactors because, although they do use fuel, they're very reliable. Finally, it's worth thinking about any other systems your vessel might have. Other systems. So these other systems could be something simple and benign like oxygen, or it could be more sophisticated like a drone bay. It's also worth thinking about whether you want to have medical facilities on board, or even assemblers and refineries. Now again, I do want to keep the size of this vessel down and focused on combat. So I'm probably not going to have a drone bay or any assemblers and refineries, but I will probably want to have a small medical facility and maybe O2. We'll see how it goes. So now, as you can see, we have a pretty good idea of what we want this ship to have. And at this point, we could start building, but there's one other step we should take. So again, now that I have a pretty good idea of what I want to build, step 2 is to sketch a basic layout. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate or detailed, just something to give me an idea of the general shape of the ship and where everything will go, such as the power supply, weapons, cargo, crew, and so on. This will also give me a pretty good idea of how big the ship will have to be in order to accommodate everything, which will help out quite a lot when I actually start building. Note that my sketch won't include everything, just some of the important bits. Also, keep in mind that this sketch is more about how things will be organized within the ship, and less about trying to make an actual blueprint. So since this ship is going to be in the front lines, I want it to be able to bring a lot of weapons to bear. So I want it to be fairly flat. So let's start by doing a top-down sketch. And the general shape, I want it to be something like this. I have a plate here, and I'll explain what this is in a moment. So that is the general shape of the hull. And the idea I had was that this plate in the front is basically what we would show the enemy as we fly in. It'll act as our own sort of cover as we get close to the target. And then when we get close, we'll rotate the ship. We'll rotate the ship this way and expose the sides where all the guns will be. So, let's erase all this. And start working on the layout. Now, it's always good if you're developing a combat ship to have the crew, cargo, and reactors as close to the center as possible, unless you want to try and fool your enemies into thinking that all these things are in the middle when they're elsewhere. It's good to have it in the middle where the ship is going to be able to defend it the best. So let's put the crew right here. And we'll have redundant reactors on either side, like this. And it's usually good to have a little extra of the important parts, like reactors, so that if some get taken out, you have backups. And then we'll have the cargo. We'll have the cargo divided into 4 parts. This way, it's close to the reactors, so the reactors will always be able to receive fuel. And again, it's fairly close to the middle of the ship, where it will be best defended. And then again, redundancy. We have 4 sections of cargo, so if by some unlucky coincidence one gets taken out, we'll have extra in other parts of the ship. Also, since this is a combat ship, I want decoys. Decoys will attract enemy turret fire away from our turrets and other components. So let's put them in the corners where it's less likely that enemy turrets will accidentally shoot our other important components when they'll be aiming for the decoys. So this gives enemy turrets a lot of areas that they'll be attracted to shooting. Again, away from all the important parts. Also, probably going to want 2 gravity drives to do some little tricks. So we'll have 1 gravity drive around here. This will allow for some special maneuvering that I will demonstrate in a later episode. But rest assured that having 2 is not redundant in this case, but will allow for some special maneuvering later on. Also, it's good to have an area to put all of your programmable blocks and timers if you have any. Now I do have some C# experience, so I will be using scripts. And of course, even if you don't, it's good to have some on board because you can always download scripts you want to use from the workshop. So we'll label this T and PB for timers and programmable blocks. And again, we want them centrally located so they're well protected. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be having rocket launchers aboard this ship. Now, since this is a ship of the line and the objective is to get the side faces directed towards the enemy, where we can bring more guns to bear, that's probably where we want our rocket launchers to be. So we'll probably line the sides, not entirely, but we'll have packs of rocket launchers along either side of the ship. And like so. And we'll just put our L's. Alright. We also want to consider where various player-made weapons will go. Now I'm probably going to utilize this space here for some torpedoes. I'll put a question mark, just in case I find a better spot to put them when I'm actually building. But I think utilizing that empty space is good. Plus, it's very near, it's very near the midpoint of these sides. And it's very likely that's the point that will be facing directly into the enemy ships. And of course, we also have some space along here that we could utilize on either side. And we could even have one shoot out. Oops. Shoot out the front from this frontal plate during our approach if we want to intimidate or maybe get lucky and do some serious damage on our way in. Is there anything else? Not really. This is about as complex as my sketches get when I'm planning a ship. Again, it doesn't have to be detailed, nothing special. Just a good idea of what the ship is going to look like in terms of the general shape and where everything's going to be located. So at this point, we can pretty much start building. And that's it for this episode. Again, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and thanks for watching.